Welcome to the 8th and last episode of the podcast Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature, a tantalizing series about uncomfortable books, daring texts, and dangerous quotes. Today, Farewell Europe. Your host is Otto Boele, senior lecturer at Leiden University, specialized in Russian literature and film history. Otto, the previous episode was about a novel from 1986, and this one is about a novel from 2011. In between, there is a period of no less than 25 years in which the Soviet Union fell apart and 15 independent states took its place. What did all these changes mean for literature?
If we limit ourselves to the Russian Federation for a moment, then the consequences of this revolution were of course enormous. The ideological pressure disappeared, censorship was abolished, especially in the 1990s. Almost anything was possible. At the same time, the writer's moral prestige declined. Writers were no longer the engineers of the soul, as Stalin had once called them, but also no longer the martyrs of free speech. After all, you could write whatever you wanted. Now suddenly it turned out that both the regime-loyal writers and the dissident writers had needed the state. The first group for the subsidies and the perks that came with being an officially acknowledged writer. The second group, the dissident writers, had needed the state because they derived their moral authority from opposing it.
So no more scandals and controversy after 1991?
Well, the literary market, and that's what we're talking about, a market with sales figures and marketing strategies. The literary market diversified enormously. Russia's literary output and consumption became much more heterogeneous than they had been in Soviet times. More foreign literature was translated, also a lot of pulp fiction. It's a myth that the Soviet Union didn't have any crime novels because supposedly there was no crime. There was crime, and it figured in the genre of the detective. But it's true that the crime novel really thrived in the 1990s and branched out into all sorts of different subgenres. Psychological thrillers, whodunits, slasher novels. Serious literature almost became a separate niche, and therefore a potentially controversial novel could not quickly cause a huge scandal.
But shouldn't we have stopped our series in 1986?
No. Unfortunately, as we can see every day in the news, Russia is quickly descending into a full-fledged dictatorship. Apart from having started a full-scale war against Ukraine, it has declared war on civil society, imprisoning opposition leaders, journalists and artists, or chasing them out of the country. Russia is once again going through a very grim spell, and this also affects Russian literature, of course. Vladimir Sorokin, Dmitry Bykov, Maxim Osipov and Lyudmila Ulitskaya, to name only a few of Russia's most prominent contemporary writers, they have left Russia and possibly will never return. Of course, this didn't start in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. It didn't start in May 2018 when Vladimir Putin was elected as president for the fourth time. The writing had been on the wall at least since his re-election in 2012 and probably even earlier. I therefore suggest returning to the early 2010s when the opposition had not been silenced yet and the Kremlin was suddenly confronted with massive protests. In this still fairly liberal but increasingly oppressive climate, scandals and controversies could occur, and they did. In this episode, we will look at a controversy caused by Lyudmila Ulitskaya and her historical novel, The Big Green Tent. In this novel, she had the nerve to stand up for the dissident movement of the 1960s and 1970s. She was accused of falsifying history, and that in today's Russia is a mortal sin.
Вы знаете, может быть, я могу и ошибиться, но может быть, сегодняшний день это день, когда московское правительство дошло наконец до них, что есть другая форма.
This is the voice of Lyudmila Ulitskaya, one of Russia's most popular authors for almost 20 years. Here, she gives an interview in downtown Moscow, where she participates in a so-called Control Walk, a playful protest that took place on May 13, 2012. Exactly a week before, Vladimir Putin had been inaugurated as president for the third time, but the day had not gone completely smoothly. Thousands of demonstrators had taken to the streets to protest the election results, which had been blatantly manipulated. On May 6th, the day of the inauguration, there were clashes with the OMON, the feared riot police, in which hundreds of demonstrators were rounded up, including opposition leaders such as Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. The control walk that Ulitskaya participated in a week later had a slightly different approach. The participants did not protest against the electoral fraud, but wanted to check for themselves whether spontaneous, peaceful gatherings in public space were still possible. The initiative did not come from a political activist, but from a writer, Boris Akunin, who managed to mobilize a number of his colleagues. Andrei Makarevich walked along, the doyen of Russian rock, writer and critic Dmitry Bykov, and Lyudmila Ulitskaya. The control walk, or walk with the writers as this action is also known, did not encounter any significant problems. No one was arrested, and the police even regulated traffic so that the participants could complete their collective walk unhindered. In the street interview, Ulitskaya expresses her appreciation for the police and the Moscow authorities. You see, nobody got hurt. Everything can be resolved in a civilized manner.
Конечно, кто-то болен, у кого-то планы другие воскресные, кто-то поехал на дачу, и это нормально. Да, это совершенно нормально.
The presidential elections of 2012 marked a watershed in Russian politics. Dmitry Medvedev had been officially in charge for 4 years, while Putin had fulfilled the role of prime minister. But then it was enough, and the roles were reversed through a simple maneuver that was referred to with a term coming from chess, rakirovka, or castling. The outrage about this setup led to fierce protest as early as 2011, and in February 2012, the punk band Pussy Riot made the headlines of the world press. In the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, they performed their punk prayer, containing the line, "Holy Mother of God, deliver us from Putin." In response to these protests, the Kremlin quickly developed a policy that would increasingly erode democratic freedoms. Compared to the scandalous Pussy Riot action and the riots of May 2012, a walk with the writers sounds very tame, especially since the authorities left this protest undisturbed. Indeed, independent writers have long ceased to be perceived as louses in the fur of the state, as they were in the Soviet Union. Under Putin's regime, that role is assumed by investigative journalists such as Anna Politkovskaya, who had to pay for it with her life in 2006. Yet the status of Russian writers is still high compared to that of their Western counterparts. That's the Soviet legacy. Writers were taken so seriously that they were either pampered or persecuted. But it's also a new role. They can stand out as moral and intellectual beacons shining through the fog of a predominantly cynical and materialistic society. Writers like Bykov and Ulitskaya. The Big Green Tent is a historical novel about the dissident movement of the 1960s and 1970s. But it's also a statement about Russia at the start of Putin's third term in office. And not because the novel happened to be published in 2011, as protests were intensifying. It was also a shock for Ulitskaya herself to discover that her novel was not only about the past. In an interview with radio station The Echo of Moscow, she said,
"When I was working on the book, I didn't realize that yet. After all, I worked on it for about 4 years. But when it was finished, it turned out to be a very topical book."
What story does The Big Green Tent tell us about the dissident movement during the Cold War? And more importantly, how was the novel received in the context of Putin's return to the presidency in 2012? In this last episode, we dive into a thick but also playful novel that has raised a few eyebrows. Why did Ulitskaya stand up so emphatically for those dissidents? Wasn't she just trying to rewrite history? This is the controversy that I'll try to unpack today. Lyudmila Ulitskaya was born in 1943. As a writer, she came to fruition relatively late. She studied biology and also worked for a few years at the Institute of General Genetics in Moscow, until she was fired in 1970. She had asked a typist from the institute to copy an illegal manuscript. Unfortunately, the typist proved to be extremely vigilant and reported Ulitskaya to the KGB. In the years after her dismissal, Ulitskaya raised her 2 sons, had a casual job at the Jewish Chamber Theatre, translated poetry and wrote plays, including for the Moscow Puppet Theatre. In the waning days of the Soviet Union, she provided the screenplays for 2 TV movies, but her breakthrough as a writer of serious literature came in 1992. The widely respected magazine The New World, which we have already encountered a few times in this series, published the novella Sonitchka that would meet with critical acclaim both in Russia and abroad. Given the patriarchal character of Soviet literature, it's not surprising that Ulitskaya was initially classified among the representatives of so-called women's prose. This slightly condescending term usually referred to the work of authors such as Natalia Baranskaya and Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, who did not necessarily write for women but did focus on the female experience of Soviet life. Baranskaya was the first to realistically describe the double burden that Russian women were under, and often still are, a full-time job as well as the care of children and the household. Petrushevskaya went a step further and showed the ugly side of Soviet life, especially in the cramped environment of communal apartments. Poverty, alcoholism, marital fights, psychological terror, and domestic violence feature widely in her work. Because of this preoccupation with social squalor, Petrushevskaya is also associated with the Black Wave that we encountered earlier with Viktor Astafyev in episode 7 of our series. It's not that Ulitskaya shuns the dark side of everyday life, but her work is lighter in tone and more optimistic. The focus is invariably on the private lives of the characters, who may clash or run into all sorts of problems, but in general they are able to overcome their personal contradictions. Characters are never idealized. Ulitskaya is averse to the pedantic prose that the official Soviet writers usually produced. Her heroes and heroines have a vulnerable side, and therefore, as readers, we can easily relate to them. Hostility, jealousy, selfishness. In Ulitskaya's work, these are transient moods rather than fixed character traits. In Sonitchka, for example, Ulitskaya's first serious publication, the title heroine finds out that her husband, an artist, is having an affair with Yasha, their daughter's best friend. Yasha is an orphan they've taken into the family, but it's a manipulative girl with a well-developed survival instinct that allows her to use her charms very effectively. Sonitchka discovers the relationship not by catching the lovers red-handed, but by an unexpected visit to her husband's studio that turns out to be packed with portraits of Yasha. Sonitchka takes one look at the portraits and knows enough. The happiness she experienced until now, but which she felt she had no right to because it was too great, too overwhelming, now definitely belongs to the past.
This was long overdue. I always knew it wouldn't last, that it would stop.
But her sadness does not translate into a hostile attitude towards Yasha, her competitor. On the contrary, Sonitchka still considers the girl a poor orphan who needs a bit of extra care.
Just like before, Sonitchka secretly put the tastiest pieces on Yasha's plate. Yasha smiled gratefully. That Sonitchka was just a weird one anyway. Maybe she's just cunning, thought Yasha after some mental effort. But in her soul she knew that wasn't true.
Ulitskaya's trademark can already be read quite clearly from that first novella. She usually writes about an environment she knows well, the intelligentsia, especially that of Moscow. The action is situated in the recent past, say the time of developed socialism, that is, since Stalin's death. The story spans several decades. This is how we get to know Sonitchka as a young girl with only one passion, reading. At the end of the novella, and a family life later, she's a heavy old woman with a moustache, as lonely as at the beginning of the story, and with a newfound love for the Russian classics. Those 3 ingredients, intelligentsia, the Soviet era, the development of a whole generation, are also the main ingredients of the Big Green Tent. Between the thick novel and Ulitska's debut lie almost 20 years. 20 years in which Russia changed significantly and the Soviet past was reinterpreted several times. And that affected the way in which the Big Green Tent was received in Russia. The Big Green Tent is a historical novel that has some resemblance to Tolstoy's War and Peace. The main characters are fictional, the fruit of Ulitskaya's imagination, but historical figures appear now and then in the margins of the story. Some of these historical figures are mentioned by name, such as Andrei Sakharov. Others remain nameless, yet are easy to identify, such as Andrei Sinyavsky, who in 1966 was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment for publishing his work in the West. And then there are characters that probably only the true connoisseur of Soviet dissidents can identify. Sometimes the novel reads like a who is who of the 1960s and 1970s. But the next moment we are immediately absorbed by the vicissitudes of the fictional characters and above all by the moral choices they face. If we try to reduce the maze of storylines to one more or less coherent plot, then Ulitskaya's novel tells about the coming of age of 3 Moscow characters, 3 classmates who are at the bottom of the pecking order at their school and therefore soon become friends. In high school, they come under the influence of Viktor Shengeli, a young, one-armed war veteran and a charismatic teacher. He introduces the boys to Russian literature and the pre-revolutionary history of Moscow, but not in the mind-numbing way that the official curriculum prescribes.
Forced as he was to stay within the framework of his school program, Viktor Shengeli was nevertheless constantly looking for what he called the strategy of awakening. He shared everything he had to offer. Simple things, really. Honesty, justice, contempt for meanness and greed.
This alternative education through literature produces its results. The boys are increasingly critical of the Soviet regime, and finally they become part of the underground world of dissidents and unofficial artists. The choice of 3 male protagonists is in a way fitting for a historical novel that opens with Stalin's death in 1953. As we saw in the episode about Aksionov's novel A Ticket to the Stars, we often encounter such a trio of sworn comrades in the films and youth novels of the Thaw. In The Big Green Tent, the trio consists of Ilya, a talented amateur photographer, but also a shrewd broker in samizdat publications, Micha, the selfless do-gooder who is committed to serve the cause of the Crimean Tatars who were deported to Kazakhstan under Stalin, and Sanya, the trio's musical genius who is long averse to any form of political activism. None of the 3 friends will ever be able to find their place in society, either before the collapse of the Soviet Union or after. Ilya, the hustler, is forced to leave the country by the authorities and eventually ends up in Munich, where he will work for Radio Liberty. As a result, he becomes separated from his wife and stepson and will never see them again. He dies of cancer. Micha also receives the offer to emigrate, rejects it at first, and is then bullied and compromised by the KGB. Eventually he commits suicide. Only Sanya lives to see the end of the Soviet Union, but he soon emigrates to the United States. In the Russian diaspora of New York, he meets another émigré, the poet Joseph Brodsky. When Brodsky dies, in January 1996, we've reached the end of the Big Green Tent. We started with one Joseph, the death of Joseph Stalin, and we end with another, the death of Joseph Brodsky. And so, we've come full circle. In interviews, Ulitskaya has repeatedly said that with her novel she solicited the audience's sympathy for the dissidents of the 1960s and 1970s. The reason she called upon to do so is that the generally accepted image of those dissidents in Russia today is anything but positive. In state media, they are not portrayed as heroes or martyrs of free speech. They are considered troublemakers who were paid by the CIA and did everything they could to weaken the Soviet Union. And yes, they succeeded. After all, in 1991, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century took place, at least according to Vladimir Putin. The Soviet Union fell apart. In the 1990s, this was still a fairly extreme point of view that mainly appealed to frustrated communists. But since 2012, it has become more mainstream and is invariably propagated through film, talk shows, and also in presidential speeches. Politics play a subordinate role in this. The issue is not the rehabilitation of communism as an ideology. What counts is the unity of the country, the survival of Russia as a nation. And this is precisely what the dissidents are believed to have counteracted. Just like the revolutionaries and the Decembrists before them, their efforts only weakened the country. With her novel, Ulitskaya wanted to oppose this dominant narrative of the dissident movement being an entirely destructive phenomenon. She sees the dissidents as a kind of avant-garde of the Russian intelligentsia, the best representatives of a social group that lays claim to the status of the most civilized, the most European part of the nation. An intelligent, a member of the intelligentsia, is not just someone who is well educated and has read a lot. It is someone who values intellectual freedom and does not submit to the ideological yoke of party, state or church. When Andrei Sakharov was still working on the hydrogen bomb, he was merely a professional. But as soon as he began to take an interest in political issues, he became an intelligent. The true intelligent resists the authority, not out of a desire for self-assertion, but to serve the people who are kept ignorant by the state and cannot stand up for themselves. Particularly in the 19th century, this sense of duty could take the form of a guilt complex. Political activism thus became a form of penance in which the intelligentsia, relatively privileged and better educated, sacrificed itself for the good of the people. It does not follow from this that every intelligent is necessarily a revolutionary or a dissident, but it does mean that he or she must be willing to adopt an independent and critical position. A highly educated person who always obeys the authorities is an unprincipled opportunist, a fake intelligent, as it were. The contrast between the true intelligent and his fake counterpart emerges in the big green tent in the personal story of Olga, Ilya's girlfriend. And just to refresh your memory, Ilya is the hustler of the trio. He sells samizdat literature to Western customers. Olga's parents are a general and a teacher of Russian literature, so she comes from a good, ideologically reliable family that enjoys quite a few privileges. They have their own apartment, a dacha, and even a car with a driver. Olga's mother is also a member of the Communist Party, and a rather fanatical one. She raises her daughter in the orthodox spirit of Marxism-Leninism, which produces the desired result. Olga is a model student at the forefront of the pioneers, then active in the Komsomol, and she marries a handsome boy from the Air Force while still in college. But then Olga commits a faux pas. She is careless enough to sign a collective letter in which students stand up for their discredited professor. The Russian reader immediately recognizes Andrei Sinyavsky, the writer who had his eccentric prose published in the West. The damage can easily be repaired if Olga admits that she was wrong and distances herself from the letter. But she cannot bring herself to do what the university is asking of her. She sincerely believes that her professor should be spared, and she will stand firm by her principles. That's how her parents raised her. For her uncompromising attitude, Olga is expelled from the university, bringing shame to the whole family. Her father, the general, draws a bitter conclusion when he says to his wife,
"That's what the university can do to a person. I told you, we should remain simple, closer to the people. The poor child is completely lost. We should have let her become an engineer, then she wouldn't have gotten any of this shit. We've lost her.
Relations within the family reach an all-time low when Olga's mother decides to show her ideological vigilance by compromising the professor even further. She writes an incensed article about his work published abroad and even volunteers to act as a prosecutor at his trial. After this, Olga begins to drift off completely. She meets Ilya and is included in his circle of friends and poets, painters and composers who have two things in common. They do not have a proper job, and their creative work can only exist illegally. Although not everyone is equally principled, it becomes clear how much talent and valuable knowledge are hidden in these circles. It's here where the link with the past is preserved, with the avant-garde art of the 1920s and the forbidden poets and philosophers of the fin de siècle. Olga's mother may be in good standing for following the party line and holding a university degree, but it's her drop-out daughter who comes closest to the ideal of the true Russian intelligentsia.
This is Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature. Your host is Otto Boele.
The Big Green Tent was well received in the West, but critical reactions at home weren't long in coming. Several reviewers noted that the novel is very loosely constructed and that it's easy for the reader to lose track. From my side, I would add that the three main characters seem quite interchangeable, and sometimes the novel reads too much like a history book in which a number of historical milestones is ticked off. Stalin's funeral, the 1957 Youth Festival, and of course the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But whatever we may think of the literary qualities, The Big Green Tent is not a one-dimensional, unequivocal paean to the intelligentsia. None of the three main characters is a paragon of fortitude. They are not cowardly, but not very brave either. And even Micha, the boy who selflessly dedicates himself to the Crimean Tatars, seems particularly naive and careless. On the other side of the ideological spectrum, Olga's mother turns out to be a little more human than she first appeared. Faced with a solid can opener from West Germany, she cannot resist making a scornful remark to disguise her frustration that such useful commodities in the Soviet Union are in short supply.
In Russia, all the strength, all the intellect of our scientists is focused on the creation of space rockets, nuclear power plants, while they are busy producing can openers. But good openers, I have to say.
The historical figures in the background are, of course, not stripped of their heroic status, but they enjoy that status mainly in the perception of the fictional characters. They are not objectively idealized by the narrator, but admired by the three friends who remain fallible and therefore human. Apart from Ilya, Micha and Sanya, their girlfriends are also pressurized to become KGB informants. It's a moral dilemma the characters are struggling with, a dilemma that ends in miserable compromise or even suicide. This is also what Ulitske refers to in the afterword to the novel.
With grateful remembrance of all those living who have now passed away and who stood behind the back of my main protagonists, those who cannot be blamed and those who have stepped into the meat grinder of time, the people who stood firm and those who did not stood so firm, the witnesses, the protagonists, the victims, all the people who will always be remembered.
Ulitskaya wants us to appreciate the precarious situation in which many intellectuals found themselves and the dubious choices they sometimes were forced to make. In doing so, she propagates those values that the intelligentsia is supposed to uphold and which must be constantly defended against the state. Sincerity, tolerance, concern and compassion for the individual. But it's precisely this emphasis on the moral conflict of a relatively small group of people that provoked the wrath of some critics. And here we touch on the topical value of The Big Green Tent. The novel is not only the subject of a discussion about the past, about the dissident movement during the Brezhnev years, but also about the present, the modern Russia of Vladimir Putin. For Ulitskaya, the dissidents were the first to open the door to a more independent way of thinking. In doing so, they made an important contribution to the dismantling of the Homo Sovieticus and the entire Soviet system. That, says Ulitskaya, is unquestionably the main merit of the dissident movement. Ulitskaya's opponents, on the other hand, stick to the narrative of the Kremlin and the state media, a narrative that sees the years of reform under Gorbachev, and especially Boris Yeltsin, as lost years, a blind alley, a pitch-black time when Russia deviated from its natural course and tried unsuccessfully to imitate the West. Putin's authoritarian policy from the 2000s should therefore be seen as a crucial course correction that reconciled Russia with itself and did justice to her aspirations as a great and powerful nation. One critic who likes to attack Ulitskaya is Yuri Polyakov, longtime editor-in-chief of the conservative weekly Literaturная Gazeta, the literary newspaper. He's the author of the nostalgic retro novel A Soviet Childhood from 2021. It can be seen as a direct attempt to refute Ulitskaya's view of the Soviet past. In an interview, Polyakov said the following, and for your information, Polyakov is trying to be ironic.
When you read writers like Ulitskaya, you get the impression that she grew up in a country where she was tyrannized, tormented, and humiliated with cheerful nursery rhymes, balanced nutrition, and compulsory summer vacations. If you believe her dark fantasies, she and her free-thinking colleagues were blacklisted for life just because they were misbehaving when going to the locker room. Children from the more privileged layers of society, in particular, suffered from this, they now try to tell us. Really terrible things must have happened in the spacious apartments of the party bosses, in the country houses of the academics and the closed elite children's camps. I grew up in the housing complex of a margarine factory, but I have very different impressions from my childhood in the Soviet Union, and they're much more positive.
What is she whining about, that Ulitskaya woman? The youth was well taken care of, asked Yuri Polyakov. His father was an electrician, and his mother operated the machines in the margarine factory. Why isn't he complaining? It's clear that a personal score is being settled here, and Polyakov does so by marginalizing Ulitskaya and her kind, presenting their critique of the Soviet Union as the nagging of a spoiled elite. With these indignant comments, Polyakov projects onto the past a contradiction that has been increasingly emphasized in the state media since 2012, and which Polyakov himself has repeatedly propagated. That is the alleged contradiction between, on the one hand, the westernized, latte-drinking hipsters in Moscow and St. Petersburg, who are never satisfied, who always have something to complain about, and, on the other hand, the real people who live in the provinces and wholeheartedly support the president. Polyakov's frustration is almost laughable when you consider that he was a confidant of Putin in the run-up to the 2012 and 2018 presidential elections, something like an agitator, if you will. For years, he served on various advisory bodies and was editor-in-chief of a widely read literary weekly. Yet he's convinced that Ulitskaya and the liberals have monopolized the media and that their dark view of the Soviet past is unjustly dominant. An even fiercer reaction to the Big Green Tent came from Lev Danilkin, historian and writer, author of a book about Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. In an interview with Ulitskaya, Danilkin clearly rejects the choices she made in the Big Green Tent. Focusing on the dissidents and their environment creates an image of the Soviet Union that does not correspond to historical reality, says Danilkin.
In your novel, you claim to be objective, to tell the ultimate truth about the dissident movement. But the space program, the main project of the Soviet Union, is barely mentioned in the novel. And then you create the impression that the most important drama at the time was the confrontation between people and state. But the thaw can also be described as an example of their successful symbiosis. Isn't your novel actually a kind of falsification of history? Especially given your status as a guru?
That is a patently incorrect question. The first thing I want to debunk is that I would be a guru. I don't claim that role at all. I certainly don't feel the need to tell the ultimate truth. The space program, you are absolutely right, does not arouse any enthusiasm in me. That is, now. Then, in April 1961, we were all overjoyed. Imagine a human being in space. But of course, it was much too early for such a gigantic undertaking to take its toll on a people still recovering from the war. Moreover, huge amounts of money were involved, and I am not even talking about how hard it was for people, especially in the countryside. If you think it was a time of complete symbiosis between state and people, a kind of idyll, that is your right, but I have the right to think otherwise. And I would also like to point out that my novel is not at all about the relationship between people and state, but about the relationship between the individual and the state.
Danielkin, the interviewer, seems almost offended that Ulitskaya says nothing about Sputnik or about Gagarin's flight into space. That in itself is not surprising for a man who's written an almost hagiographical book about Gagarin. But Danielkin also thinks all this attention for the dissidents is inappropriate. It distracts from the miraculous synergy that supposedly developed between the people and the state, and which hasn't occurred since. Also note his vocabulary, and that of Ulitskaya. She is concerned with the tension between state and individual. Danielkin speaks about the union of people and state. Even more questionable is the eagerness with which he qualifies Ulitskaya's choice of subject as a falsification of history. This is indicative of the extent to which the historical debate in Russia has come under pressure, and the Kremlin is trying to impose its triumphant vision on national history. Through textbooks, feature films, historical theme parks, and the occasional article of the president. The leading role of the state and the national leader is emphasized again and again. For the last time we get the floor to Ulitskaya hater Yuri Polyakov. Here he reacts to a statement of hers that Russian society has been permeated with pure aggression at least since 2012.
Statements by writers such as Ulitskaya, writers of such a political direction, should not be taken seriously at all. These are people with an eminently skeptical attitude towards Russia. I have no idea if they were brought up that way at home or if it's a moral sprain of the intelligentsia.
Polyakov made this derogatory statement in 2018, when the discussion of the Big Green Tent had died down and the fraudulent presidential elections of 2012 had long been forgotten. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 led to a national euphoria that spawned numerous memes and metaphors, slogans and symbols centered around the idea of Russia's ultimate rebirth, the Russian Spring, the Russian Resurrection, the Russian world, a term used to denote the entire Russian-speaking community around the world. And the same happened after Russia launched an all-out war against Ukraine in 2022. In this atmosphere, you could easily be accused of unpatriotic behavior, Russophobia, and even rehabilitation of fascism, charges that were also partly enshrined in law. It's this aggression and national frenzy that Ulitskaya had warned against, and of which Polyakov is such a clear exponent. 2014 is also the year in which Ulitskaya received Austria's Europäische Literaturpreis, a prestigious award bestowed only on the greatest European writers. In response to this prize, she wrote an article for the German magazine Der Spiegel, in which she reflected on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and what this would mean for the political and cultural climate within Russia. She said she was ashamed of Russia's silly and aggressive parliament, of the silly and incompetent government, and of Russia's national leaders who can only appreciate blunt force and cunning. And she was ashamed of her own people, who seemed to have completely lost their moral compass. Ulitskaya even foresaw a longer, perhaps final parting of ways, with Russia drifting further and further away from Europe and losing her ties to European culture.
I fear we will never succeed in joining the European family of nations. Our greatest culture, our Tolstoy and Chekhov, our Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich, our painters, musicians, philosophers and scholars have been powerless to neutralize the religious fanatics of the communist idea or the rapacious lunatics in the here and now. For 300 years we people of culture have fed on the same sources, our Bach and our Dante, our Beethoven and our Shakespeare, and we have not given up. But now we, representatives of high Russian culture, have nothing left but to say, farewell, Europe.
This was Ulitskaya in 2014, and you can only admire her far-sightedness. Since then, the situation has become much, much worse, with an obsessed President Putin wielding absolute power and a propaganda machine that churns out lies only to preserve a corrupt regime and justify the war against Ukraine. To hope that the pendulum in Russia's relations with the West will swing back in the opposite direction is simply naive, at least for now.
This was the last episode of this series. Otto, what do you hope people have learned from this podcast?
Well, at least that they have enjoyed themselves, despite my pessimistic comments just now. But I also hope they've learned something about Russian literature and what it can teach us about Russian history. If you want to understand Russia, you have to know her history. That goes without saying. But also her literature, especially her controversial novels.
This was the last episode of the podcast series Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature, made by Otto Boele and Kai Mastenbroek, produced by Electrical Films. Voice actors are Marcusa Hamer and Domenico Gemoli. This series was made with contributions from the Anna Croisset van der Kap Fund and the Leiden University Center for the Arts in Society. The names of the translators and other important references can be found in the description of this podcast. The series is copyrighted by Otto Boele and Electrical Films.